All right, so it's Todd Atkins, and I'm here with Miguel Iturrate, MMA Museum Project, MMA Museum Podcast, MMA Collector 74 YouTube. Check it out, subscribe to it. And today you can kind of learn a little bit more about Miguel because we're going to talk about the story of BoDog Fight promotion. Now, some of you that watch this probably know what it is. Some of you that watch this may not know what it is at all. But Miguel was involved with this promotion, so we're going to kind of tell a story of that. And you can learn more about Miguel through that. And before we do, as always, check out Live to Fight Design, Instagram at Live to Fight Design. You can use my promo code Todd Atkins, and if you do, you get $20 off your order. Fight banners and gym banners is what you can order here. So, Miguel, I kind of want to first ask you. Let's talk about what was BoDog Fight. What was the idea? Who was the one who came up with this idea? Do you know how it came up in the first place?
Well, if you're starting a BoDog Fight there, the story is always going to start with Calvin Ayre. Calvin is a guy that, as I understand it, is a Canadian guy. And he's one of the guys smart enough to have made the computer programming for, I think, poker or whatever became the online casinos that we see today. So he was on board with one of the first ones. There are different versions of this software, but he owns one of them. It was his. He made that's as far as I understand it. And what kind of chaos is that? A guy like that has a lot of lore around him, and he was a guy who liked playing the personality game. So, the idea was he launched his site, and he said, "I'm going to make $10 million and retire to Costa Rica," which he has property here and stuff there. So he was living his dream later, right? But he made $10 million in like a week. So it was like he hoped to have it in a few years, kind of thing, and retire. And he made it in a week. So that's
Jeez.
I don't know if that's verifiable or 100%, but that's the kind of story you hear about the guy.
Yeah.
He lived in Vancouver as well, and people in the Vancouver area knew him. The connections were in his gym. He had some people from the music business that he was connected to there. And somewhere in there came the idea of BoDog Entertainment, which was BoDog Music and BoDog Fight. They sent an ambassador out, which was a guy named Greg Allen. Greg did a tour of a bunch of shows. Find, like, besides the UFC, like, who else might be involved. They weren't going to get the UFC, right? So they wanted to compete with the UFC. So they were going to find an existing company. So I think Greg, after being at a couple of our shows in Atlantic City, which at that point we were doing under the name Euphoria with Russian backing, he selected the Russian backer, and the Russian backer signed the contract to create BoDog Fight with Calvin.
Now, let me ask you this.
Vlad Lovrinovich.
What was his name? I'm sorry. So can you tell me the backer, what was his name again?
Vlad Lovrinovich. Okay. Vlad.
Now tell me this, where did the name BoDog come from? I mean, it just seems like an odd name for promotion.
That's a Calvin Ayre name. That was BoDog was his casino, his online casino. Oh. And it's catchy, and I guess somebody they worked it out, or had a company create a catchy name, or they worked it out down to BoDog of some way. But he used that for more than BoDog Fight. It was his casino. The lifestyle was later on a website called BoDog Life, and everything they did was kind of under that flag in that era.
Okay, so tell me about how he gets to Costa Rica, because you said he had done this in Atlantic City, right, when he first linked up with this backer.
Yeah. Okay, so that story goes, I started off at Hook and Shoot. Hook and Shoot also became the AFC in Florida, where we were backed by Dan Lambert for like 15 shows. And it was Dan who called me one day. I guess I was his matchmaker. I'm not sure he was maybe trying to get rid of me. Maybe I think at that point, after 15 shows, there are people under his, closer to him that could do the matchmaking. I was helping Carlos Diaz, who eventually became his matchmaker for a few the rest of the shows. And we're friends, right? So, but he called me, said he received a call from somebody looking to invest in a show that was Russian people, and Dan wasn't interested in being involved, but if I wanted to go and meet those people, I should. And I went to a little boutique hotel in New York, and I met this guy, Vlad, and we set up shows. You can look at the roster on the shows; they were a step up from the type of talent that we've been managing. So, like at Indiana shows, there was a little bit of a step up. Like there were bigger shows when we went to Florida, and then from there, if you're looking at things that are kind of in my silo, Euphoria was a jump again. I mean, at the end of the day, I was, Pride did Joaquin Hansen versus Eve Edwards. That's a top middleweight, lightweight fight rather.
Mhm.
I made that fight, and Pride blocked it. They wouldn't let us do it because they had Joaquin under contract. They let him do the first fight of a tournament, but not the second. So it was an experience of having a little more budget. Vlad was putting something into it, but Vlad, at the end of the day, I think Vlad, I'm not sure he was 100% passionate on just fights. Like it didn't spring from a love of the sport. It was more of a business endeavor, but he was crazy and he was a lot of fun. But he signed the deal with BoDog, and then from there, at that point, there was communication problems all the time.
Right, but to take on an undertaking of doing a show in Costa Rica,
that's BoDog.
Yeah, when did Calvin decide? Do you know like what year that might have been when he first decided to start trying to do it there?
Well, the thing is he's in California. He's got, they had a skyscraper in downtown Vancouver where they were on, floors 40 through 49 or whatever, whatever the deal is. So they had their presence in Vancouver, but Vancouver, you can't just go do MMA there, in the early, 2000s. That's around the time, I guess 2005 is when Calvin probably said, let's do BoDog Fight and let's go out and find it. But by 2006, we were up and running. And they wanted to do a reality show around it. The idea was, by doing BoDog Fight, you're putting the TV show on the United States, you're actually advertising their online casino, which was illegal at the time, and made Calvin the big boss and outlaw in the United States. There was the rumor that I believe is true that like he couldn't, when he went to Costa Rica, he probably owned a plane at some point, right? But if he had to fly, there was no way he could stop in the States because he'd be picked up, So there was that little outlaw nature of that. And, at the end of the day, when you're doing television ups your budget a great deal. If you're going to produce 12 weeks of television and produce 12 slots there with $3 million, you're actually getting an episode, for $300,000, which is really cheap for television, especially in that era and stuff. Those are very superficial and high level numbers, but that's roughly what happens is, well, what can you do with $3 million? It's like not all that was spent on the fighters. Most of it was logistics, but it included good raises for people and some contracts where you could, show people you're devoted to them and get people's devotion. And by that, I mean, that they can quit their jobs and dedicate themselves to fighting.
Now, were you already in Costa Rica before he decided to come here and do the show, or were you not?
No. The first time I went to Costa Rica was on Calvin's dime, working for him, doing the first season of BoDog Fight. And that was the first time I set foot in this country. After I left BoDog, I got an offer from a company here that asked me to relocate, and that's how I wound up here. And I probably, I don't know how that would have gone if I didn't have the experience of having been here, half a dozen times with Calvin and like I knew how it was here. So, it was an influential decision, but it wasn't because I was here or anything like that. I didn't live here in Costa Rica at the time. The BoDog had a bastion here. I think they had a call center and stuff like that. So they had stuff here. There was I don't know details because I really didn't care. And now I'm not going to remember, reading an article on it and stuff. But Calvin was his home in Costa Rica. I think he was hosting a poker party, and he got raided by the FBI. With cooperation of the country and stuff. So, like I said, he was a little bit of an outlaw, but he had, operations. That's what the word I was hunting for. He had operations in Costa Rica already. He wasn't a tourist here.
So did that incident happen before BoDog or maybe near the end?
I think we had signed the contract and not done the show. And when we got to Costa Rica, like the last time Calvin had made the news was the raid on his house. Yeah.
Oh. What materialized of it? Did he do any time or?
No, nothing. They didn't get him either. So he was free. But it was interesting. He made the billionaire list, and nowadays, 15 years later, economies are high, so even billionaires, it's thrown around a lot more now than it was back then. And he was on that billionaire list, whether legitimately or not. He was in the conversation in the ball game. He loved to roll that way. And he was a guy like that when he showed up on the beach, all of a sudden there's, 3 guys in suits with, a little bump, where a gun would be, 3 or 4 of them walking around in black suits and sunglasses on the beach. So, yeah, he was one of those types of, high level people with a lot more on his mind than just the fights.
Let me ask you this. Was this the first fight promotion in Costa Rica? MMA wise, I guess.
We didn't air in Costa Rica, and we didn't sell tickets, and there was no public to it. So it didn't matter really where it was.
Oh, okay.
Costa Rica did have smaller shows. I worked for Fight Night for a few years afterwards. They were based in Costa Rica, and they were similar, a sport book attempt to do higher level fighting, but they had low level shows here, and by low level, I mean that the talent was beginning to develop and it was a brand new sport. So it looked like the sport looked like in 1995 in Costa Rica until, Calvin showed up, and, then they, you take a 200 room resort on the beach and rent out every room for 2 weeks. That's the kind of things that Calvin's BoDog did, and then we took over the hotel for 2 weeks and just shot everything there. No tickets were sold for the fights.
The reason I'm asking, I know they didn't sell tickets, but you've been in Costa Rica all this time now, from then to now. What was Costa Rica like back then?
Yep. Like it is today, it has its good points and its bad points without getting into, too much life experience, because I have been living here for about 15 years now. Calvin is a North American, he's Canadian, but he's a North American with a ton of money. And Costa Rica counts on the tourism economy. And then beyond the tourism economy, at that time, they were also very liberal towards having the sport books do their, all their storage of, the data online and stuff like that. All the servers and everything were here, and the laws were protective of them here. And, such that even though the American government wanted them to shut things down, there were many sport books operating here with many customers in the States that they couldn't shut down. So it was a place that people like that did business. And then he does something like this, a show. Now he's rented out a hotel. He's contributing to the economy here. And guys like that, I think, put thought into some of those things like that. So that's why I think he said, oh, yeah, we can do it in Costa Rica, like, no problem. I'm sure in his head he knew, in general, that Costa Rica would be cheaper in doing it in Vancouver.
The reason I'm getting at is, so the reception of this whole project was good with Costa Rica.
Oh yeah, no, there was no publicity. Like interestingly, I heard later on when I worked for Fight Night that the owner of that sport book was trying to reach Calvin to come and see the fights because he knew they were going on, but he couldn't even, when he couldn't get Calvin on the phone or whatever the deal was, he couldn't even get in. So there was no local buzz. The only people locally who would be interested with it was the models that got hired. You know, they would go out and hire 30 models for the couple of weeks there. And you know, they come with some entourage, makeup artists, their camera and production people like that, you know, gophers, van drivers, everyone like that understood what was going on. But it really is at that grassroots level. There was no like, you know, posters downtown or like, hey, the fights, you know, did you see? And we were isolated on this resort. That's the other thing. Twice on these resorts where you're kind of far off. So it's not like we, you know, it's not like 10 of the fighter guys went into town to one of the bars and, you know, just made a spectacle, got caught on pictures, and, the crowd realized and started talking, and people were like fighters, and, there's a commotion. They couldn't even do that. I'll tell you a funny story. The Tambor one was so isolated. And, the guys are the guys, So one guy, I believe he was one of the Canadian guys, schmoozed up one of the girls that cleaned up the room, that did the maintenance in the hotel, and said, let's go out or whatever. She was like, we can meet at a bar at another hotel that was, near the beach, and there was very little around there. And he was like, bring friends. And there were 76 fighters and 76 cornermen there. Just start with that. So I think 35 men showed up, and she had like 3 friends with her. So we were out in the boondocks. I think that's the best example of it. Like, actually, people were, beginning to say 2 weeks locked up, kind of like that. People started having biological needs.
Now, tell me your first introduction to Calvin Air. Do you remember where it happened, what the circumstances were? Huh?
I never really talked to him.
So you got hired, but you never talked. How did it happen?
Live, ostensibly, Calvin sat above so much, and we were so small that Calvin actually had a CEO, a guy named Peter Carroll, that was in charge of BoDog Entertainment. So Calvin was the guy who did drive-bys. When we did the big shows, yeah, he'd show up on his helicopter, watch the fights, and take off. That he wanted to do the fights, liked to do the fights. Guys on my crew talked to him. He was accessible at times, but I was never pulled into a meeting or asked to give any type of report or anything like that. And I didn't know if it was appropriate for me to talk to him, because I felt like the guys, like my boss, my immediate bosses were the guys who would talk to him. You know what I mean? So there was also that point. Like I could talk to Peter. I'd walk into his office, or if there was I talked to Vlad. They were the partners on that thing, and so I was just trying to be politically correct. So I actually never really talked to Cal.
Now, kind of tell people, like you said, it wasn't an audience show. This was a television type project.
Right.
So maybe, as someone who's going to work at that, did they pitch this to you, or is this, when you're coming in, did you know that's what it was going to be?
There was, the UFC had just done Tough, and obviously the end result was that it was looking to be successful. So, BoDog had an ample marketing department and stuff like that. Like I said, they occupied multiple floors of a skyscraper with their operation with that. But there was no real clear direction, and to me, in turn, like, for example, major mistake was to copy the UFC's Tough model and do secret fights where you're not releasing results. It's okay to not sell tickets, but put out the results like when they happen and things like that. And then, you don't have to worry about leaks. We didn't really have many problems with leaks. People were cooperative, and they knew that the show was trying to put them in a light, and people fought their butts off. So they, but it was a little bit of a pain in the ass to put on the fights, and then, you know, for it to be 6 weeks before you're going to see them on TV, or, you know, I think it was probably more than that, you know. So I thought that was a bad strategy. I don't think you could show them live. I don't think we had, you know, the juice for that. I think you could do your TV show anyway, but put out the results like real news. And that way, you know, I don't know how that would have helped, but I don't think it would have hurt. It looks like you're copying a concept, and it didn't work out for you because we're not on Spike. We were on an inferior channel. And so therefore the people weren't really actually seeing the fights anyway. So you had slick, really top-notch produced TV shows with kind of shameless TNA, which doesn't hurt for viewers, but you're on a channel where, you know, you're really not going to get seen by many people in the American public. You don't get taken too serious by, you know, other people in the business. So that was a little bit of the problem there. Is I just think that strategy-wise, they had no way of putting stuff or moving forward. They were just going show to show. These were very rudimentary.
So was that kind of the feeling around the show for people like you that were working, like, where is this going? What are we doing? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that there was a lack of singular direction. I don't know if they wanted me to do it, but as a matchmaker, you know, there were times where you felt, no, you're just kind of a mid-management type of person. They don't want too much strategy or too many ideas from you. They want you to just deal with the fighters. So, you know, could I have stepped up and been Dana? You know, I'm not claiming that I'm not that good. You know what I mean? So, there were some people there that meant well, but I think that there were also some other people there that didn't really mean well. And that's a problem. You know, people are, if it's a sinking ship in terms of money, you know, writing that is the first job, you know, that should be there. And you got people kind of working against that, then, you know, so be it. You know, it didn't last long after I left. And I think I qualify that on my end. Like I said, the guys with the contracts, Chael Sonnen was another one of those contracts. Chael, Masvidal, you know, Chael didn't hold the UFC belt, but Chael, Masvidal, Eddie Alvarez, Cain Velasquez, you know, we if those people managed to be, you know, just continue with their careers, we had stars on the roster already, locked up. But if you don't have a strategy to keep that going, and you have a strategy to show that to the people, then you know, you're going to be you're behind the UFC already, and it becomes tougher and tougher. So there was a rumor. We did a pay-per-view, the first pay-per-view, and there was a rumor that I'm pretty sure is probably true. So I got called into Peter's office, and he asked me to make some phone calls and see what was up. They were having trouble reaching our pay-per-view company to try to line up the second pay-per-view, which I think was Fedor Lindland. So they're trying to get a date. They're trying to do this, and the pay-per-view company executive that we dealt with for the first one was not calling us back. And the rumor was that person left the cable company and was employed by the UFC afterward.
Hmm.
You know,
was it true?
I don't know 100%, but I suspect that, you know, Dana was playing three-dimensional chess at that level, and everybody else in the business was still at the checkers level. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying I think Dana was just more cutthroat than everybody else, and so I think he's capable of that. But it seems, you know, that wasn't going to save us getting that pay-per-view on a month earlier or whatever, you know, whatever happened there. But yeah, there were a lot of forces working against him. Too many Chiefs, not enough Indians. You know, a simple suggestion, for example, because they did BoDog Music under the same flag. On the first pay-per-view, somebody comes up to us and says, Peter wants to put a band on in an intermission. So I pulled aside some of the people that I considered my peers. I was like, I'm going to go tell Peter this is a bad idea. It's for many reasons. I've seen them try it with like comedians. I've seen comedians open an MMA show, bands, whatever kind of show. You're not, if you attract the right fight audience, you're going to have people that don't like, that modern kind of like, pop punk sound that you're going to put out with this band. It's a turnover. And one of the things that happened there is they had to do 2 songs, I think, and the boxing commission wouldn't let them start. And I think one of my guys, we were running around, we had to get them earplugs. And I wanted to tell them the band is a terrible idea. You're actually doing the band harm. Because no band wants to do a crap gig like that. I mean, if you're going to tell them, yeah, we worked out the budget, so here's some money for it, they're going to do the gig. They're going to do the gig for promotion, to be on TV, to be on pay-per-view. That's superficial stuff. It's going to be a lousy gig for them in an arena with the lights on and old men of a boxing commission in front of you. So for them too, and it was a bad idea. But I was advised heavily not to, because apparently the singer of the band was dating Peter's daughter. She was like, no, don't do it. Just don't do it. First of all, I'd be wrong, and then I'd make an enemy of the boss. So, when things like that, you can't make honest suggestions on business, and I'm glad somebody told me, that Peter wouldn't react well to that, and I just kept my mouth shut. And that's how you wind up, keep your mouth shut during other occasions there, and letting it go, because you can't really have a normal conversation.
Now, how many shows did you end up doing with them?
I believe once that all was said and done, they put on 1 or 2 fights on every episode that was done of BoDog Fight, and I think we topped off at about 75 episodes. Those were recorded. We did a show in Vancouver, which was a major recording, which I think probably had 25 fights over 2 days. We did the same in Russia, in St. Petersburg, which was over the course of 2 days, 25 fights. In Costa Rica, we did 12 fights a day for 3 days in a row, after having everybody at the resort and doing all the shooting for the TV show there. And that's how they did it. They get everybody for a couple of weeks, shoot everything, so some of the fighters getting massaged in a Russian parlor, they went that one day there, and another guy went and got his leg tattooed, and people are taking pieces and making the TV show up, so you bring a lot of crew with you too, to get that accomplished. A lot of people actually working, on the fly, that, like that, so you see the good and the bad of how things could work.
Now, what do you think the reception was to BoDog from the MMA community in general, looking back on it?
Yeah, I think it's underappreciated. At the end of the day, I think in terms of money, and like I mentioned, just the names I just mentioned to you that went on to become superior talent, at the highest level, for the time period, because Strikeforce, Affliction, they all had great rosters. They didn't have 120 contracts out like I did, but they had great rosters. But I think I was the first of the great rosters that could have rivaled the UFC. That's just my opinion. But I think it will be forgotten that way. I think because we were the first, it didn't make the impact, didn't get seen, by enough people to remember for sure. I think if you talk to the fighters of that era, I think that will give you a little bit better of an idea, because there were fighters that said, okay, if I'm not going to be in the UFC, I'd like to be in BoDog. And I think that we were, Shudo, even some of the established companies, Hook and Shoot, nobody else was an option like that, not like the UFC, until I think we were the first, really. That's why we got ground up pretty quick.
Now let's talk about, every show comes to an end. Why do you think BoDog ended when it did?
You lose enough money and you don't have a true passion for it, which, between Vlad and Peter, I don't see, people that really care, they cared more about seeing the spreadsheet at the end and seeing the money coming in, a la UFC, and now it all would have been great. And then you leave the fight people to do the fight work. But when they start getting involved and wanting fast track things, and it becomes difficult. Without the passion, very few people have the staying power. My hat's off to Chowdhury and Warren, Dana, Coker to a certain extent, although he's more of a guy I think sometimes maybe cashing a check, but my hat's off to those guys because that's longevity, but that wasn't in the game for BoDog.
Yeah, I think it's something interesting to talk about, like, promotions now that are trying to come up like PFL, which you talked about. One, how can you survive that period of burning cash, losing money, whatever you want to call it?
Passion.
Yeah.
Passion. You have to give it. If the guy who at the end of the day is losing it doesn't care, I know this is gonna, it to a certain extent. That, for example, Bob Meyerowitz, the first owner of the UFC, he had that passion. He sold the UFC and got out, and that's because he was a businessman, and this really wasn't his cup of tea. But I tell you, he had that passion because for the kinds of things that he was put through in the first 30 shows, litigation, and that type of stuff, that he stayed 30 shows just tells me he did. He had the passion, and that meant I see that could be bigger and that this could be a cash cow. But he had that passion for the sport, and then he got out. One of the potential buyers there was a guy I mentioned in this conversation, Dan Lambert, who's the ATT owner and the sponsor of the AFC Florida shows. And he has the passion. But even he, I think I've heard him in interviews, he'll point to like a certain time period. Like after 2007, he kind of turned it over more into a business. And, now they've got a money-making enterprise where people are actually hiring their gym to train their fighters. Like they have a dorm with Russian fighters there, and everybody pays a percentage of the business. So even he, he's still around the sport. He found a way. If he hadn't found a way to make money on the sport, he'd probably be all right with still losing money and watching the sport because Dan has that passion. But at some point, even he turned it into something different. Now he's got, every ship right, so he's not burning money. But he's still there. You know what I mean? A lot of people, the money burning goes away when they leave the sport. Dan didn't leave the sport, and hopefully, I'm sure he's in the black at this point, but that's not everybody's story. But he got there because of passion. Dana, undeniably, maybe his passion was to be a billionaire and to be every.
Keep going.
Even the Fertitas, 40 million in the hole, but you may disagree with them, and passion has certain different levels. It's like I'm sure they deal with the passion, like they sit cage side and watch every fight, and that sort of stuff. Like they're going, incognito to watch fights. No, but you saw them rolling around with people. You saw them interact. That's the passion, man. They wanted to be close. They wanted to be touching. Them. They went 40 million in the hole and allowed themselves to stay on board until that got righted. There's very few stories where they've actually righted the ship and started to make money. But that's the number one thing I think was missing there. At some point, Calvin likes the fights. Calvin maybe would still do it. Maybe if it was just book kept with just fights, it might be an acceptable loss for another couple of years for him. But at some point, if that ship didn't get righted, and the tools were there to right it, but I just don't think that the leadership was there.
Why do you think Lorenzo got out when he did?
I can't, money. whatever they invested in the show, which was $1 or $2 million, they turned into whatever billions they got. And
well, they invest a lot more than that when they lost 40 mil, right?
Right. No. And keep in mind, they were casino owners beforehand. And if you go to the Vegas casinos, I think this is still correct. I don't even if it's not correct anymore, I'm pretty sure it is. It gives you an idea of how intertwined they are. I mean, these are rich people already. In the station casinos, which are the ones they own, you can go in there and you can do anything you want in terms of betting or whatever. But I think you can't bet on the Houston Rockets. And the reason for that is because there's a third brother that owns the Houston Rockets. So the Fertitta family in their portfolio has the Houston Rockets on there. And because it would be a conflict of interest, their book cannot take bets on the Houston Rockets. So I think you need a pretty penny to buy the Rockets. I don't think that Mr. Fertitta, I forget the Rockets owner, that Fertitta, but I don't think he got.
I think his name is Tillman Fertitta, I believe.
Okay, good job. Yes, you're right. So I don't think Tillman picked up the Rockets for $1 million and could sell them for 10 million or whatever, or 10 billion like the other guys did. So I think you're dealing with what's his motivation. He's actually made more money than the richest brother. Both of them. The two. That's just a possibility. But why did he get out too after 15 years? Maybe you want to get out and do something else. A lot of people would have left. Dana stayed on. But we talked about this on the Joe Silva podcast. Interestingly enough, analyzing it, very few people stayed on in that transition too. So, I think people move on. But Meyerowitz moved on, said, I'm done, and I think Lorenzo, with a couple billion in the bank from this, yeah, now he gets the back power slap and skateboarding. And isn't he 50 or what is he doing? Letting his kid, but anyway, I digress. He's the billionaire.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to kind of get these, to see kind of how the wheels are in motion and stuff, how this all gets presented to fans. Some of these shows, I know you guys I remember seeing you talk to Tom Atencio about Affliction. I think that was.
Yeah.
So I think it's good for fans to see these shows and know about what these people have to do to put them on, and kind of the history of some of these other promotions that were out there that contributed to the sport.
Yeah, no, that's why I like doing it with you here. I don't think, that I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to be out of my mind that this video went viral or anything like that. But I do think that it becomes a situation where if anybody even in the future is interested in some of the history, it's there and it's documented. So I think it's pretty important.
Yeah. Well, as always, Miguel, I want to give you a chance before we go to talk about MMA Museum, MMA Collector 74 YouTube. Kind of give us update.
Yeah, the MMA Collector 74, that's the YouTube site, and that's where we do the MMA Museum podcast, and we do the MMA Collector episodes where, we talk about memorabilia, and the interviews are, in-depth interviews with the fighters. We got Jen Howe up this week, and Woman's Pioneer, and that one's been getting a little more attention than we usually get. It's still a new site, so, viewers are crawling up slowly, but the Jen has a very good interview. All the women have a very interesting story, especially the Pioneer women, because they usually have a little bit extra, they've been through things that even the men haven't been through, and therefore, and Jen was about as honest as they come. So I think that's an interview that's well worth watching. And so head over to MMA Collector 74, the YouTube channel, and the MMA Museum podcast there has got Jennifer Howe on tap, and there's probably about 20 podcasts there already, 15, something like that. You can go back and listen. It's usually me and the fighters just chatting. So if you've gotten this far, maybe that's your fare as well.
Yeah, and people who support this show, I'd appreciate if you go there and subscribe to MMA Collector 74, and if you want to subscribe to this channel or share some of these shows, share some of Miguel's shows. And as always, people support the show. We appreciate it. Until next time, take care.